and what institute you work for.
Sure. My name's Mark Kastel. I work for the Cornucopia Institute. We're based in Cornucopia, Wisconsin. We're a farm policy research group. We look at farming and food issues and act as organic industry watchdogs.
Organic industry watchdogs. That's interesting. So organic industry watchdogs as opposed to food industry watchdogs, which means there's some issues possibly with what's labeled or certified organic. Is that correct?
Organic agriculture has been around for a long time. In fact, before the 1950s, really all farmers were organic farmers. It wasn't until after World War II that the agrochemicals became widely available. So starting in about 1980, we saw the commercialization of the organic sector, where consumers wanted to opt out of industrial food. They wanted food that was grown in a more environmentally sensitive manner. They were concerned about agrochemicals, they were concerned about drug residues, they were concerned about the humane treatment of animals, and they were willing to compensate farmers more fairly so that economic justice was really built into that organic price. As the industry's become more and more lucrative, it's now over a $30 billion food sector here in the United States. It's gotten very attractive to the multinational agribusinesses that control most of conventional food. So they've gobbled up many of the pioneering organic brands. Our job at Cornucopia is to protect the livelihoods of family-scale organic producers and the authenticity of the food that people are so hungry for.
Very interesting. So that, and I want to make sure I really understand the implication of that. If food is labeled organic, it still is grown organically, even if the parent company might be a very conventional or a company that uses GMOs. But so that still means that the food is grown organically, correct? I mean, is the certification still valid?
Well, that's the theory. And in general, we can trust the organic label. But there are people pushing the limits in both in terms of the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. So the question is, can you produce organic milk on a 10,000 cow factory farm? Can you produce organic eggs in a hen house with 100,000 birds that never go outside?
100,000 birds.
100,000 birds. And forget about the fact that the Organic Foods Production Act mandates that animals get treated in a certain manner. So one of the requirements is that all organic livestock have access to the outdoors, that all organic ruminants, so dairy cows, beef cattle, sheep, have access to pasture. God created these creatures to graze on grass, not sit in front of a feed trough in a CAFO, in a concentrated animal feeding operation. So we have large corporations, large food manufacturers pushing the limits of what truly is organic and lawyering up and hiring lobbyists and playing the same games in Washington that they played with in the conventional food sector. The other factor we look at is imports. So we don't even trust the Chinese for ingredients in our dog and cat food any longer after the melamine scandal. Why would we trust them for the supply of ingredients in our organic food that we're feeding our children?
And is that the case?
We've seen an exponential increase in imports from countries like China, India, Central and South America, the former Eastern Bloc, former Soviet Bloc, Eastern European states. Many of these states, like China, have endemic levels of commercial fraud. So counterfeit name brand goods, intellectual property rights, piracy. There is documentation of fraud within the domestic Chinese media in the organic industry. So why would we trust these people? And the USDA has not been doing a judicious job, as mandated by Congress, to make sure that our organic food is beyond reproach.
Okay, so at the FDA, I'm assuming there's got to be a committee like an advisory committee, some kind of committee on organic food? What constitutes organic food in terms of who dictates what's labeled and how things are labeled? There must be a committee.
At the USDA.
Oh, it's at the USDA, not
Yes.
the FDA. Okay, so at the USDA,
Well, the law that charged the USDA to oversee organics is a very good law. Congress passed the Organic Foods Production Act of 1990, and one of its elements was creating an advisory panel, the National Organic Standards Board. It's a broad-based panel of stakeholders. So there are 4 farmers, there's a conservationist, there's an organic certifier, there are organic handlers or manufacturers. So all the different stakeholders. But they did 2 things. One, they loaded it up with a public interest representative and independent farmers so that agribusiness could not dominate this panel, in theory.
in theory.
In theory.
What are you
But
implying?
both during the Bush administration and the current Obama administration, they appointed a number of corporate shills, if you will, into these spots that were reserved by Congress for independent stakeholders in the organic community. The most egregious example of that was during the Bush administration. I wish I was making this up. They appointed an executive of General Mills to sit in the public interest or the consumer spot.
What?
There was such an uproar that, and led by Consumers Union, publisher of Consumer Reports magazine, one of our allies in fighting to maintain the integrity of organics, that they withdrew her name and later appointed her, she was a food scientist, in the one seat set aside for a scientist. Now, I'm sure Congress did not envision putting just one more corporate executive on the board in the scientist spot. They probably thought they were going to put an academic or someone with an independent voice there. So we have 2 farmers on the board today, as an example, quote, farmers. One's a full-time employee of Organic Valley, which is a farmer-owned cooperative, but it's a billion-dollar business enterprise. The federal law says to qualify in that slot, you need to own or operate an organic farm. She did not own or operate an organic farm when the USDA appointed her. There's another farmer on that board appointed by the Obama administration who works for Driscoll's, I think the world's largest berry producer. They don't grow organic strawberries. And she's not an owner or an operator of an organic farm. But when we did a Freedom of Information request, we found out that just a couple weeks or literally days before she was appointed to this board, Driscoll's became certified to produce the nursery stock, the plants that organic growers would use. Now, whether they're actually producing organic nursery stock or that's just on paper so she could qualify, I can't really testify to. But unfortunately, there were a number of highly experienced and qualified organic farmers who wanted to be on that board, who had been nominated or applied to be on that board, who were passed over so that these corporate representatives could sit in these seats reserved for independent farmers.
So this is the board at the USDA that oversees organic certification.
This is the board that sets the rules. Most federal advisory boards, or FACA boards, are really just that, advisory. Congress actually gave this body statutory authority to do 2 things. One, advise the secretary on policy issues. So when you're deciding how much a cow has to graze to really qualify for being organic, this board helps determine that. The other is anytime a synthetic is used in organics, or anytime a non-organic agricultural product is used in organic food. So let's say it's not available in an organic form. It has to be reviewed, vetted, and recommended for use by the NOSB, the National Organic Standards Board, before the secretary could put this on the list of approved substances. And so this was the buffer that Congress created.
If we have so many large conventional food producers buying up these organic, smaller or organic businesses, and so now we have General Mills or Kellogg owning, or Clorox owning, organic companies that produce organic produce and organic food or organic other issues, other items. if the large parent companies have their own self-interest now representing the consumer and the scientist on this FACA, this Federal Advisory Committee that actually has statutory rights,
Yeah. It gets,
it's going to dilute down what's truly organic, right?
it has the potential to do that, and it is. And so when I talk about synthetics and organics, we could probably all agree that organic cupcakes are good. I like organic cupcakes. To make an organic cupcake, you need baking powder. There's no such thing as organic baking powder. So that had to be reviewed, and it checked to see that A, it wasn't deleterious to human health, B, it didn't injure the environment by its use, that it was compatible with organic systems, and finally, that it's essential for use in organics. So in other words, you can't make a cupcake without baking powder. If you could, you can't approve that synthetic. So now we have a board that's looking at all kinds of gimmicky nutraceuticals and food contact chemicals, and they're saying, well, we use those in conventional. We need to be competitive in organic food. We need these approved. And here's where the conspiracy comes in. There's a report on the Cornucopia website entitled The Organic Watergate. This was the wake-up call for us. We started looking at how the materials were reviewed. So not only do we have a board that's been stacked with agribusiness-friendly representatives, the board is not a scientific body. Again, there's only one scientist out of 15 members. It's a lay body of very experienced stakeholders in the organic community. Congress knew that when they set it up, and so they enabled the board to go out and hire technical advice, scientific advisors to do what's called technical reviews of all these materials. Well, when we took a look at who was doing the reviews, they're corporate executives and consultants to the agribusiness industry. So we found a number of materials that has no business being in organics, like carrageenan, a product that can cause severe gastrointestinal inflammation and health problems, even tumor formation. And so one of our jobs at the Cornucopia Institute is to out this duplicity and to put pressure on our regulators, either through the regulatory rulemaking process or, if necessary, in court. The other way that we could create pressure is to empower organic consumers. So if you go on our website, we rate every organic dairy brand, so you can figure out which ones come from that 10,000 cow factory farm and which brands come from family farmers whose cows have names, not numbers. And likewise, you could take a look at which brands of organic soy milk or chocolate milk or sour cream have carrageenan in there and which brands don't. Just by virtue of the fact that there's, for every organic product, there's someone manufacturing without carrageenan, proves that it's not essential,
right,
which means not legal to use in organics.
Interesting. So I'm curious, I mean, GMOs come up a lot, and I know that's not something that your organization really looks at. However, do you think because this advisory body now is so co-opted, do you think that we'll be finding GMO, genetically modified foods in or things labeled organic? I mean,
well, yes and no, but I should qualify. We do look at GMOs.
You do?
And
okay.
we look at we have our own little niche where we look at the economics and the politics. There are lots of groups looking at the health implications, which is very difficult to do because the biotechnology industry, Monsanto and others, actually have in their contracts with farmers a technology agreement that prohibits the farmers from using any of their crop for research, other than agronomic research and yield research. So they can't partner with a physician or a medical researcher to take a look at the impact on human health or the impact on laboratory animals. And so they really impeded our ability to understand whether GMOs are safe.
Okay, I want to go over what you just said, because if I'm understanding it correctly, it's astounding. I mean, I know there's a paper recently that's just been retracted, or about to be retracted, Cirolini's work, and I think there's a Dr. Swanson who's done some work. And so, are you telling me it's...
I don't think that paper was retracted. I think it was it was not retracted by its authors.
No,
there was
not-
a lobbying campaign to cause the publication to retract its publication.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean necessarily that that material is invalid.
Exactly. Oh, no, I wasn't implying at all that it was invalid, but thank you for clarifying that.
Sure.
What I'm trying to find out is that, are you telling me that it's illegal? The biotech industry has made it, they've dictated somehow that no one can really do research on their seeds
Research without their blessing.
without their blessing. And so who are they giving the blessing
Sure,
to?
that's the question. And so we have a very limited amount of research happening in terms of research on laboratory animals. Most of these studies last 30, 60, 90 days. There aren't lifetime studies generally being done. And so the real big study that's being currently conducted are on 300 million plus guinea pigs, the American population. We will find out in subsequent generations what impacts these have. The few animal studies and studies on livestock that have been done show some pretty disturbing evidence of problems in terms of organ development, in terms of their impact on our gastrointestinal flora. We now know that the pesticide genes that are inserted in one of the types of Monsanto corn products is finding its way into mothers' bloodstreams and the bloodstreams that are feeding our fetuses. So what impacts that'll have are somewhat unknown, but we feel in the organic community much more comfortable operating under what we call the precautionary principle, which what really governs the regulatory approach in Europe, that first we prove that it's safe, then we introduce it into the human food system. How many products have we introduced, whether it's sodium saccharin or a whole list of other synthetics that we find? Aspartame.
Acylfame.
Well, aspartame's still on the market. But
Yeah.
how many materials have we introduced that were perfectly safe?
Oh, right.
That we've subsequently decided, or patent drugs, that we subsequently have decided really destroy human health and are highly dangerous, and then remove after a lot of damage is done. So the philosophy of organics is that we don't take those risks, that we depend on truly natural food production, and that if we're going to introduce anything else, that it be very, very carefully studied before we start putting it on the plates of our children.
So the mere fact that the biotech industry has to approve who's going to be allowed to do research on their seeds or on their new products, and yet they, what you hear proponents of the industry say, one, that if you question the safety of GMOs and some of these pesticides, that you are anti-science, or that TED Talks don't even allow you to question the safety of GMOs on their site.
Don't worry, be happy.
Yeah, so, well, we can go into that too. But my question is, their side, the proponents of synthetic food production, say that, well, there's no proof that GMOs aren't safe. There's no proof that these things aren't safe, but yet then they're impeding the research that could show it. So it's...
Jesse Jackson once said, if you want the right answers, you have to ask the right questions. These people don't want to know, and they've made it very hard to find out. There's a lot of pressure in the research arena at, for instance, the land-grant universities, that we have more and more of our research at public institutions being funded by corporate agribusiness and corporate biotechnology interests. And so if you're an independent researcher and you want to study some of these problems or potential problems, you run up against a culture that says, are you sure you want to do that? Because even though you might have access to public funding, you're going to endanger our relationship to our biggest private funders. Do you want a future at this institution? Do you want a future in this profession? And people are intimidated and back off. They've also seen how independent scientists that do research are victimized and intimidated when they do publish or attempt to publish research that does shine a light on some of the problems. That there's a piling on and a ganging up. It's really unprecedented in the scientific community that there would be so much peer pressure to shut up.
Wow.
How many chemicals have been introduced commercially and later withdrawn because we find out they cause cancer or some other deleterious health impact, like sodium saccharin? And that's not an exception. It's common. There's a lot of pressure on scientists at our land-grant public universities to shut up. There's a lot of pressure, even though they might have independent funding, since such a preponderance of our funding for agricultural research is coming from the biotechnology sector, coming from corporate agribusiness, that the message to these independent scientists all too often is, are you sure you really want to do this? Are you sure you want to potentially alienate our largest donors? Do you want a future at this university or in this department? And so the message is clear. Be quiet, get along.
What if they're tenured? Is there still pressure on them to not?
There is pressure because they're all interested in funding, and so they could end up being ostracized. And certainly out in the marketplace of ideas, there's been a piling up, if you will, on scientists that have a relationship with the biotechnology sector, ganging up on those that would dare challenge its propriety.
So we see this in pharma as well,
Absolutely.
in medical
it's the
research.
same players in many cases.
It is the same players, isn't it? Can you tell me just a little bit about that? Because I'm aware of some of the players being the same.
Well, many companies are making patented drugs and agrochemicals like pesticides and genetically engineered seed. And so the interest in the crossover, the same scientists work for different firms. There's this revolving door between these chemical and genetics companies and drug companies and the FDA. And even when they aren't passing through that revolving door, they've many times gone to the same university programs and belong to the same country clubs. So, they're not rubbing shoulders with farmers. They're not rubbing shoulders with consumers who have a real concern about what's in their food. And so there's really almost a mindset in terms of kneeling down and worshiping at the altar of this scientific approach and really discounting what we've learned through many thousands of years of agricultural stewardship. And that's what we're trying to apply in the organic sector.
There was a study that Stanford published, and it had made some claims that there was really no difference between organic produce raised and non-organic. And my question, I know I've interviewed other people who claim that some of the pesticides, certainly the glyphosate, and I'm not sure about the neonics, but some of the other pesticides or herbicides chelate out the minerals from the soil. Mm-hmm. And so if that's the case, and we know that, and that's like factual, that's easily enough tested, I would assume, then how can there be no difference between produce raised organically and non-organically? If the soil has more minerals, then you're going to get more minerals in the produce. So there has to be a difference. So I was quite confused over that. I don't know if you know that study, if you want to talk about it.
I am familiar with that study, and I always say follow the money. And right when they released the study, they were very clear by saying, we didn't take any agribusiness money. This was all supported independently by funds we had at Stanford. So we decided to look at where Stanford's independent money was coming from, and it came from corporate agribusiness and biotechnology. That was a big surprise. Some of the researchers that worked on that were researchers that worked with the tobacco industry that also decided that tobacco maybe wasn't so dangerous for your health. So it's really difficult. So there have been other studies that have looked at the nutritional benefit of our food, conducted by Consumers Union, an independent nonprofit, conducted by the USDA, that have found higher nutrient values in organic foods and demonstrably lower levels of agrochemical contamination. So how did Stanford come up with different numbers? I can't really tell you what their approach was, but I can also tell you that Stanford is the home of the Hoover Institution, which has been an ardent opponent of adopting organic agricultural practices, along with the Hudson Institute and the Heartland Institute and many other very conservative, some might say ultra-conservative think tanks that also get money from corporate interests.
That was the question I was just going to ask you. I mean, it sounds like these institutes are fronts for exactly. Okay, so I know this isn't your field, but I want to ask you your opinion on the health of our nation. So if these small independent organic companies, they start out small and independent and truly organic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they get bought out for lots of money by these larger conglomerates, these food processing companies, Kellogg, General Mills, all these, Nabisco, all these companies. And if they're those companies have control of this advisory committee, then are we going to start seeing GMOs leaking into organics?
Well, the answer to that is yes and no. In general, the answer is no, because part of the bill that Congress passed is as GMOs are explicitly banned in organics.
That's good.
So organic seed can't be GMO, the crops that we feed our animals can't be GMO, the beets that you put on your table can't be GMO. And so for folks who want to assure that GMOs are not part of their diet, organics is the gold standard. The problem is that some of these gimmicky ingredients that they want to add might be GMO. So as an example, a company called Martech Biosciences, it's a part of a Dutch conglomerate called DSM. It's a $12 billion company, the same size as Monsanto. They make an algae oil that they started putting in as a nutritional supplement in infant formula. And even though it's hexane extracted, hexane is a solvent byproduct of gasoline refinement, explicitly banned in organics. They were putting that in. So the Obama administration and the Bush administration were looking the other way. Now, that's illegal, and we're pursuing that. But we found out by looking at the patents when they applied for use in organics that this is manufactured, these strains of algae were created through a process called classic mutagenesis. So that's where they take the genome of a plant and bombard it with either radiation or very harsh chemicals to change its genetic makeup. And by accident, the hope is that they will end up with traits that have more commercial value. In this case, algae that would create a higher omega-3 oil content. And so they're sneaking these into organics. So these products are now in Horizon organic milk. These products are in some of the brands of infant formula, even organic infant formula. And so that's where our job as a watchdog over the National Organic Standard Board is so important, so that they don't compromise. They can't compromise on the crop production being GMO, but are they going to find sub-ingredients that they can do a fancy song and dance with their lawyers and lobbyists and somehow get through?
Question, is the DHA, extra DHA food, eggs, the organic eggs that have DHA added to them, is that from that product?
No. Eggs that are labeled higher omega-3s or DHA are that way because the food that the chickens are eating are a little different. They feed them flaxseed, which is high in omega-3 content. They feed them organic flaxseed. So that's not some gimmicky material that was made in a laboratory. That was something that was grown on an organic farm.
Wonderful. Thank you for that information.
And there was just a study out that proved that organic milk has much higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids than conventional milk. Why is that? Because organic cows are mandated to graze on fresh green grass. And conventional cows are usually in a building, confined their whole lives while they're being milked. And they don't have the sunshine, they don't have that wonderful fresh feed. They have stored, highly concentrated feed, and it produces healthier cows with way healthier milk.
You mean the grass-fed?
Grass-fed.
The grass-fed, because grass has omega-3. Any green-growing plant's going to have high omega-3.
The cow's multiple stomachs are designed to digest grass. God created these creatures to eat grass. We can't eat grass, so they can take these marginal lands that might be erodable, that wouldn't be suitable for raising crops on, they can convert that to really dense nutritional food for us.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you another question, and I know it's not your area of expertise, but you look at food all day, and you know, so you do know something about food and nutritional quality, and you do believe in the precautionary principle, and you know the health of our nation has really declined dramatically in the last 20, 30 years. And especially in the last 15 years, we've seen an exponential rise in autoimmune disease, autism, behavioral problems, especially focus, attention deficit, but the ulcerative colitis and colitis and Crohn's diseases that we're seeing now, especially in children. And I'm wondering, and I know you can't say with any certainty, but is there an opinion that you have on that in terms of its relationship to possibly the introduction of, because that was around the time we introduced GMOs to the food chain, and I'm wondering what your opinion is about this.
Well, I'll tell you two things. One is that from a policy standpoint, we create cheap food in this country. 40 years ago or so, we were spending about 16% of our incomes on food and about 8% on healthcare. Those numbers have almost completely inverted. We have the cheapest food, bar none, in the world, and bar none, the most expensive healthcare. And the outcomes are abysmal in terms of longevity, chronic diseases, infant mortality, premature births. If you compare us to any other industrial country, we are going backwards. And a lot of that has to do with this very highly processed diet filled with synthetics and the way our food is grown. So food and exercise are really the key to life. So if we're sitting in front of TVs and small screens all day, eating Cheetos, eating fast food, what's that going to do to our metabolism? The relationship to GMOs is a little less clear, but there's circumstantial evidence that might cause us to ask some serious questions. One is that we know that some of these products, not only the GMOs, but the widespread use of glyphosate as a herbicide. These crops are resistant. Normally, this herbicide would kill corn or kill soybeans. And so we've ramped up the use of these toxic chemicals. It's changed the microflora in the soil, and it's changed the microflora in our digestive tracts. And we're just beginning to learn more and more about how our bodies are really made up of billions of microbes and little bacteria, lots of little critters that are not dangerous. They are actually adding to our health and our nutritional well-being. And so whether it's broad spectrum antibiotic use or residues of antibiotics in our food or synthetic dyes, synthetic preservatives, agrochemical residues, all these things have an impact on our well-being. We're also learning that the way we've measured the impacts of agrochemicals in our diets on our health is a bit outdated. That yes, we want to look at what levels are toxic, and we want to look at the carcinogenic properties of these chemicals. But we're learning more and more that in their most minute doses, many of these synthetic compounds act as endocrine mimickers or endocrine disruptors. And so if they're present at very critical junctures of development in utero or in very young children's diets, in mother's milk, in infant formula, or in food and during developmental periods, especially in the development of sexual organs. They're very sensitive to these chemical triggers, these hormonal triggers, and some of these can cause lifetime catastrophic impacts.
Well, if they're acting as endocrine mimickers, then they could theoretically increase breast cancer. Any hormone-related cancer would increase from, if something was sitting on the estrogen or unbinding estrogen,
Sure.
If it's an endocrine mimicker, it certainly could affect estrogen levels and estrogen metabolism. So I would imagine that could be maybe one of the reasons that we're seeing such a large increase in breast cancer rates these days as well.
And not just breast cancer, but I would testify that probably the human mammary gland is one of the most sensitive organs in our species to chemical compounds that have a tendency to bind and accumulate in fatty tissue. So just as we know the amphibians that we share this planet with are the coal mine canaries in the rural environment, we're seeing problems with the other non-human species that we share the earth with. We should be listening to them and their impacts their lifespans are shorter, their metabolism is different. These warning signals are being ignored.
Right, and the bioaccumulation is going to take a shorter time period. You're going to see it moving through generations. That's a good point, and that brings me to, and maybe I'm wrong, but weren't we seeing, wasn't one of the reasons that PCBs were removed from the market was because we were seeing amphibians with really weird genetic defects?
Well, that was one of the problems, and the bioaccumulation, and the fact that these are extremely persistent chemicals. We've soiled our own bed. There are PCBs and dioxins in the mother's milk and sperm of mammals in Antarctica. You know, we've never spread them up there. So again, we're dialing back to the precautionary principle. We should know what we're doing before we spread millions of pounds worth of toxic chemicals in our environment. You remember that most of these compounds are biocides. They're designed to kill life. So why are we so surprised when they get into our bloodstream that they end up killing us?
It's a really good point, and you're not the first person to bring that exact point up. That it is something that scares me, and I'm scared for the young generation right now, and they're, the people that are, in grade school right now, when they're having children, what are we going to see? One of the things I want to ask you is...
Sure, because let me just interject for a second. The whole question about GMOs, they have been in our food system for such a minute blip in terms of human evolution, not even a full generation. So we really don't know what long-term impacts we're going to see.
And thank you for bringing that up, because I have to ask you another question. I've heard proponents of the industry also claim that GMOs have been around for hundreds of years, and often nectarines are used as the example, and they'll talk about, that we've been modifying our food and hybridizing our food, and there's no difference between that and a genetically modified organism. And I'm wondering if you want to just take us through that briefly.
Yeah, that's a specious argument, because we have been manipulating plants for many generations, but we don't insert genes from other species into those plant cultivars. So we do cross plants that are related to each other. We don't put fish genes into tomatoes. We don't use viruses as a transporting vector. We don't use antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the process. And part of the problem is the particular genes that they insert, but they rearrange the genome and they create unintended consequences in terms of the genetic makeup of some of these plants. So we really even don't know. So the impacts in totality on the genetic makeup of some of these food items that we're eating are unknown. But plant breeding has been around for as long as we've been an agricultural species.
So let me ask you about feeding the world, because this is something that we all hear again, that if we question the safety of GMOs and don't want, and if we want GMOs labeled even, we're then that makes somebody mean and insensitive, and they don't care about poor, starving children. I mean, I've heard serious people say that. Are we feeding more people with genetically modified organisms? Does it increase our yield? Are we able to feed starving? Have we alleviated starvation around the planet with our genetically modified food?
We haven't done that yet, have we? I don't know of any plant that's been genetically modified that has increased yield and had a benefit in terms of producing more food. Most of the yield increases we've had during the period of time that GMOs have been in the marketplace happens in the traditional plant breeding that are being done in conjunction with the genetic modification. So it's the traditional, not the GMO manipulation of the genetics, that's causing yields to increase. But quite frankly, we can't feed as many people as they're forecasting. And instead of scientists trying to figure out how to manipulate agricultural production, we should start to think about how to more smartly manage population on this planet, because there is going to be a carrying capacity, a finite carrying capacity. It might not be food. It might not be peak oil. It might be peak water. We don't know what factor will cause a population collapse, but at some juncture, we will have that population collapse in our species and many other species that can't be replicated. And what impacts that will have on future generations is a grand experiment that we're willing to risk right now.
Okay, so my final question to you is, if, we haven't tested these foods, we haven't tested the GMO movement, and, as you said, everything was raised organically till 1935?
I say 1950, and we were using synthetic fertilizers before that, but most of the pesticides and insecticides and synthetic fungicides, none of them were around.
None of them were around. Okay, so it's fairly new. Our health has clearly declined. I mean, it's hard to not admit that, right? I mean, I think everybody would admit that the health of the average North American has really declined, especially citizens of the United States. I mean, we have a lousy outcome in terms of our health care and in terms of infant mortality, all the things that you talked about, and certainly all our diseases are on the rise. Obesity, childhood diabetes is, type 2, not even type 1, but even though type 1's on the rise, but type 2.
There's also a real increase in a lot of behavioral problems
Absolutely.
in children and adults, and some of these can be tied to synthetic additives in our food, the way our food is processed. And so it's not just physical maladies that we're dealing with. And really we have kind of a synergy here between the chemical industry and the pharmaceutical industry, because we have this medical industrial complex that we're living a lot longer than we did 70 years ago. But now how are we doing that? And what is our quality of life? And what are the impacts on how well we're living? Why
is the USDA, why is the FDA, and even in some cases the EPA, right? In some cases these foods are, the jurisdiction is the EPA.
Well, the chemicals are.
Well, I know just from the genetically modified potato, which is not in the market now, but when it was, in Michael Pollan's book, he talked about how he called, the FDA and asked about the safety, and they said it's under the jurisdiction of the EPA.
Well, that's because the food is actually licensed as a pesticide.
Right, so that's what I'm saying. But why is it that our government...
Let's eat pesticides. Yum.
Why is it that our government is turning a blind eye to all of this kind of, I call it shenanigans going on? Where, okay, no longer, this food's not going to be under our jurisdiction because now we're going to say it's a pesticide, so we've washed our hands of it. And then the EPA says, well, we've had this pesticide, on the market for years, so we don't really care if it's in a potato or corn or whatever, because we've had it, so we'll let it go on the market. And we see the health failing, and we see our health care costs skyrocketing.
Don't worry about those levels of contamination, because they're under the safety threshold that the government regulators have set. And when they're not, we'll just change the level of concern. So they just doubled the level of residues that are legally acceptable from glyphosate in our food, the most widely used herbicide in the United States.
Mark, what do you see as the solution to this? I mean, you're involved with policy, farming policy, food policy. What's the plan? What's the game plan? How are we going to correct this?
Well, my mantra is don't panic, go organic.
That's good.
So now it's our job and so now I ask the operative question, who owns the organic label? We do. Farmers and consumers and people who are interested in better food. So we really have to work together. Unfortunately, farmers have no clout. There's less than 2% of our nation still involved in production agriculture. It used to be to win federal office, you had to be concerned with the farm vote or statewide office in many states. And now when the presidential candidates get done kissing the rear end of the ethanol lobbyists in Iowa every 4 years, you'll never hear about food and farming again. So we have a secret weapon at the Cornucopia Institute, and we have one in the organic community, and that's the organic consumer. So there are millions of consumers who passionately give a damn about the pedigree of their food. And they want authenticity. They want to support the true heroes in this business, the farmers and their business partners that provide wonderful, nutritious, and safe food for our families. And they're willing to stand up. So we need to work together. That's why we encourage people to visit the Cornucopia Institute website and not just blindly go to the store. We've published scorecards that empower consumers to vote in the marketplace for rewarding those farmers that are really walking the talk and those corporate brands that they can really believe in, and sending a really important message to the agribusiness executives that are exploiting the goodwill of the organic consumers, that we're not going to give you our precious money if you're not going to respect our values.
That's a great answer.
It's a shame we have to do this, because the organic seal should be the Cliff Notes version of doing your food research. And we want to get back to that point. In the meantime, astute organic consumers have to educate themselves a little bit, because the good news is there's wonderful organic food out there. You just need to decode the different brands in the marketplace to make sure you're providing your family with the very best.
Thank you so much. It was really informative. So another question I have for you that you may or may not be able to answer is an opinion on, food isn't the only thing that's genetically engineered and modified. We have viruses that are, and they're used in vaccinations. And we've certainly seen very similar modus operandi in terms of the industry and how it studies the safety of vaccinations. And I don't even think that most people are aware that these viruses are genetically engineered. And so I don't know if you have an opinion. Again, it's not your field of expertise, but do you ever see any crossover in terms of the MO of the business? And do you have an opinion on also all the vaccines? Like when you and I were little, we each got probably 6 vaccinations. But by age
now they have hundreds.
Yeah, and by age 1, babies have had 24 vaccinations. And by age 18, in some states, it's 53 and growing. And so I'm curious what your opinion is in terms of how that's impacting our health.
Right. You're right. I'm not qualified to answer that question. The only thing I'll tell you is there is a difference when we get involved in crop production with GMOs. We're releasing these novel organisms that have never existed on Earth before into the environment. We can't call them back if there's a problem. If we release genetically engineered salmon and they escape from their farms, which they're going to do,
Absolutely.
and breed with our wild stock. Does anybody remember the Irish potato famine?
Yes.
You get very narrow ranges of genetics and then you have diseases wipe them out. We could end up with no wild salmon. And so the difference between that and medical applications of GMO is at least we're not on a wholesale basis releasing those. So is the problem vaccinations in themselves? Is the problem some of the ancillary chemicals that are used to preserve those? Or is the problem the GMOs themselves? I don't know, but are there any scientists looking at this?
There are, but to answer your question, that actually it does cause antigenic shift and antigenic drift when you vaccinate. So if you're vaccinated against a certain strain of a virus, you might see that decline, but then another strain that has been dormant that we've never seen, that's more potent or more lethal, now
it's going to evolve.
It's going to evolve. And so instead of Bordetella pertussis, we see parapertussis. So there is that antigenic shifting with vaccinations.
The other question with all patent drugs is who's looking at the interaction between these different treatment modalities. And we're evolving into a species that lives in a chemical soup, a myriad of chemicals that are present in our food, either intentionally as synthetic ingredients or unintentionally as drug and agrochemical residues in our food. And then we combine those with the number of prescription drugs and off-the-counter drugs that people are taking, and how many people are taking 6, 10, 12 different drugs in addition to these other chemicals. We test them individually. We never test this chemical cocktail that now exists in our bloodstreams.
And in our waters.
And in our water, right, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. It's been incredibly informative, and you're doing amazing work at the Institute. And I want to thank you personally for doing what you do.
Well, thanks for your kind words, and good luck on your project.
Thank you.